Today we're going to be reviewing the Contax Zeiss 50mm f1.4. As someone whose work primarily demands that I'm shooting on zooms, given that I'm doing documentaries, I'm traveling sometimes, I'm working with smaller crews, whether it's in the dock space or something else, I wanted to see if adding a vintage prime lens to my kit would help complement my zooms and kind of help elevate my work a little bit. So is this lens the silver bullet that I've been looking for, or is it going to be my downfall? Well, stick around and find out. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm doing a lot of dock work, and so zooms are pretty much a necessity. And this might be a position that you're in or similar to it, where you have to work really quickly. You don't have a lot of time or crew to help you kind of swap out lenses. And so having a zoom is really going to help you not miss a shot and be able to kind of stay in the moment more. The reason why I'm considering looking at vintage lenses is because, well, one, they're generally a lot cheaper than brand new lenses, and they're camera agnostic. So something like this Contax Zeiss lens, it's really small and lightweight. It's a 50mm, it's fast, and I've adapted it to EF. So it's pretty simple. You just get this little adapter ring on the back of this CY mount, and I have it as an EF mount, and so I can use it on my Sony cameras. I can use it on my Red Komodo with a variable ND filter behind the lens, which is really nice. And then because it's small and compact, it doesn't make like an obnoxiously sized rig. And then I've got like a little step-up ring to put a 77mm filter thread in front of it. So if I want filtration, a matte box, a different ND filter, that type of thing, it's pretty easy to work with. The other thing that is nice about vintage lenses compared to modern photo glass is that they generally have more character. And so this is part of the reason why I'm considering or have added vintage primes to my kit, and I'm considering what do I want to keep and what's going to work for my shooting style and my workflow. Is these lenses have more character. They're older, they don't have like lens profiles built into them, and so kind of what you shoot is what you get. A lot of newer photo glass has kind of weird distortions or vignetting that just gets corrected in camera, and these lenses don't have that. So if it has a little bit of light fall off or a little bit of distortion or a little bit of like swirl or funkiness to the bokeh, that's something that you're gonna have to live with, and it's probably the reason why you're looking at these lenses. Overall, I can see why this lens is much beloved and has a cult following. And for the most part, I've really liked the images that I've shot with this lens. The image is kind of soft without being like too mushy. It's still detailed. I like the way the colors are rendered. I like the bokeh in the lens. When it flares, for the most part, I have really enjoyed that look. And overall, I would say it lives up to the Zeiss name and the Zeiss hype. So from a practical standpoint, this lens checks all of those boxes. It's small and compact, it's fast, has a lot of character, and I can adapt it to multiple cameras. But this lens does have one problem, and it's probably the reason why I started with Zeiss in the first place. Zeiss has been a special brand for me, and the reason for that is because of this lens, the Sony Zeiss 16-35. It's a lens that I purchased about 9 years ago for my A7S Mark II, and it's a lens that I took on my first international documentary trip to Lebanon, and I walked inside of that mosque for the first time in downtown Beirut. The images that I captured with this lens and the way that this lens flared absolutely took my breath away. And since then, I've captured just tons of my absolute favorite images on this lens. The way the optical design is built just does something really special with the flares. And so since then, I've been trying to sort of capture that feeling ever since. And I think it's the reason why I started looking at Contax Zeiss in the first place, was to kind of get back to some of that feeling and that awe and that wonder when you look at an image through your camera and through the glass that is in front of the camera. Now for me, the Contax Zeiss 50mm, I think it's a lovely lens and it has some really good qualities to it, but it also has a few characteristics that are not my favorite and don't remind me as much of this guy. At f1.4, this lens has some really like funky blooming characteristics going on in the highlights. It definitely is not sharp at all at f1.4, and if you stop down to f2.8, all of that clears up. The lens is razor sharp, the colors are crisp and snappy, and I like everything about it at f2.8 and beyond. But at f1.4, it just doesn't have like a sharp and reliable characteristic to me. And I think if you're in kind of like an evenly lit environment with not too many highlights, then I think the softness can be kind of pleasing on skin tones and you can kind of get away with it. But if you're in an area with direct sunlight and it's creating some highlights, just this lens to me doesn't react the way that I would expect it in those environments. And I don't think this is a bad characteristic on its own. I know that there are a lot of photographers and filmmakers who actually really like this blooming characteristic in the highlights, but I just don't like it because it doesn't match some of the other primes that I've tried out. It doesn't match my zooms in any way. And I think it's just kind of a little bit of a distracting characteristic. It doesn't have, to me, like an awe-inspiring Zeiss snappy colors with like gorgeous flares. It's got like a real like vintage feel and kind of like a romantic charm to it. And so in that way, it is an interesting characteristic, but for a lot of the work that I'm doing, if I'm shooting at a really fast aperture, I don't want that sort of unpredictable bloominess happening in the highlights and in high contrast areas. The other thing that I will say about using this lens specifically, and it's just something to keep in mind with vintage glass in general, is that it hasn't been super reliable when it comes to the operation of this lens. I'll show like a close-up here, but this lens has a decent amount of oil built up in the aperture blades, and so it's made changing the f-stop difficult in certain scenarios. So I have to store this lens with the aperture blade closed down to an f16 so that the blades are like overlapping on each other and the oil spreads out. Because if I open it up to f1.4 and then I leave it on my shelf for a week, that oil is gonna be like condensed in a smaller space and it's gonna kind of get stuck and sticky. And especially if I take it, to a cold location and I go to try to like stop it down, the blades are gonna be stuck wide open and I'm stuck with an f1.4 aperture, and I didn't want that because of a number of reasons. And so I haven't had a ton of issues if I store it at f16, but again, if I'm out on a shoot and it's a cold day in downtown Seattle and I'm shooting at an f2 and I'm at an f2 for an extended period of time, and then I move to a brighter location, and like sometimes the oil gets like stuck and it's can be really frustrating and kind of slow me down on set. And so for the reasons of like the highlights having some funkiness wide open and the like lack of reliability when it comes to the aperture blades, it has been a mixed bag. And the aperture blade specifically, this is something that's my copy. If I bought a different copy, I wouldn't necessarily be having to fight that issue if I had a copy that was a little bit cleaner, but then I'm having to like sell this on eBay again and having to buy other copies and potentially, test them out, return them, and doing that sort of hassle. I really like this lens and I understand why it has a cult following, and I could just sell it and buy a copy that doesn't have the annoying lack of reliability that comes to the aperture blade specifically. Some of this is probably just a byproduct of shooting a lot of doc style stuff, a lot of run and gun stuff, where if I'm shooting on a prime lens, it needs to be consistent and reliable because I'm trading some flexibility for a zoom to use a prime to get a little bit more character, to get a little bit, blurrier of a background with a little bit more bokeh. and I need that prime to perform in the way that I'm expecting it to. My copy of the lens is an MMJ lens. It was made in Japan. It's got the green f16 marker, and it does not have the Ninja Star bokeh. I don't mind the Ninja Star bokeh necessarily, but that's the copy that I'm dealing with specifically. I don't know if the German-made ones maybe don't have that bloominess on the highlights. If you own a German-made version of this lens and it performs a little better or cleaner at f1.4, let me know, because I would really love that if that's the case. Much like filmmaking itself, the world of vintage lenses is as much about the process as it is about the final result. I think some people really love hunting for the perfect copy of a certain lens. And while I don't mind that process, I think it just means that this specific lens, the 50mm f1.4 Contax Zeiss, is not one that I'm gonna hold on to long term. I think all of this means that my quest for kind of recapturing that romantic feeling of seeing the Lebanese sun flare through my Zeiss lens for the very first time, that feeling specifically, I think my quest to recapture that feeling in a vintage prime is just getting started.